You have probably never done anything you would call evil. You have been unkind, certainly. You have been cowardly in the way most people are cowardly, declining to speak when speaking would have cost you something, looking away when looking would have required a response. You have benefited from arrangements you knew were unfair and told yourself that your awareness of the unfairness was a form of partial exemption from it, but nothing that rises to the level of the word. Nothing that belongs in the category you associate with historical atrocity, with the faces in the photographs, with the names that appear in textbooks as examples of what human beings can become when something in them fails catastrophically. That distance between you and those names feels stable. It feels like character. This is the assumption worth examining, not because you are secretly monstrous, but because the assumption itself may be doing something you haven't noticed. It may be the primary mechanism by which the thing you're most afraid of remains invisible to you. Hannah Arendt attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, expecting, by her own account, to encounter a fanatic. What she found instead was something far more disturbing: a man of relentless mediocrity, whose primary cognitive characteristic was not hatred or ideology, but what she would later call thoughtlessness. Not stupidity, thoughtlessness, in the precise sense, the absence of the activity of thinking, of stopping, interrogating, submitting one's own actions to genuine moral examination. Eichmann had a role, he had procedures. He had a narrative in which he was a competent professional, doing what was required by the system he served. He was not suppressing a conscience. The conscience, as a functioning instrument, appeared to have been suspended by the sheer administrative density of what he was embedded in. Arendt called her conclusion the banality of evil. The reaction was fury because people heard it as exculpation. It was the opposite. The claim was not that Eichmann was not responsible. The claim was that the mechanism that produced him was not exceptional. It was ordinary. It was available. To you, specifically, it was available. This is the part that requires a particular kind of attention because the mind moves very quickly to defend against it. The first defense is historical distance. Those were different conditions, a different country, a particular political configuration that could not repeat itself. This defense is not entirely wrong. Conditions matter enormously. But it is being used here as a termination, not as the beginning of an inquiry. The relevant question is not whether the specific conditions will repeat. It is what the conditions were actually doing, what function they served in the psychology of the people inside them, and whether a structurally similar function is available under different names. The second defense is character. I know what I believe. I know what I would do. This one is worth staying with longer because it reveals something. When you say you know what you would do, you are making a claim about the stability of your values across conditions you have not experienced. You are asserting that the person you are in your current life, with your current social position, your current relationships, your current material security, your current self-narrative, would remain essentially continuous with yourself under radically different pressures. You are claiming that character is portable. There is almost no psychological evidence that this is true. Philip Zimbardo, before he became primarily associated with a single controversial study, spent decades trying to understand what he called the Lucifer effect, the process by which ordinary people come to perform acts they would, under other conditions, describe as evil. His conclusion, derived from both experimental evidence and historical case studies, was not that evil people exist. It was that evil-producing situations exist, and that the vast majority of people placed inside them behave in ways that are functionally indistinguishable from the behavior of people we retrospectively classify as perpetrators. The situation was doing more of the work than the character. The character, it turned out, was far more context-dependent than anyone had supposed. You have never been in such a situation. That is not a character reference. It is a biographical fact. Dostoevsky understood something about this that the social scientists arrived at a century later, but he understood it differently. From the inside, from the side of consciousness rather than behavior. His underground man, the narrator of the Notes from Underground, is not a bad person in any conventional sense. He is in fact a person of acute moral awareness, someone who sees himself and others with a clarity that is almost surgical. And yet his actions are consistently cruel, his relationships consistently corrosive, his capacity for self-justification essentially unlimited. He is not unaware of this, he documents it, he analyzes it. The analysis itself becomes a way of not changing, because to understand something fully in his logic is to be somehow absolved of the obligation to be otherwise. The underground man is not a monster. He is what Dostoevsky believed was a widely available human configuration, a person whose self-knowledge has become a substitute for self-transformation, a person who has replaced the uncomfortable exposure of genuine moral encounter with the more manageable project of moral self-understanding. The specific cruelty the underground man enacts is not spectacular. It is the cruelty of small betrayals, of deliberate humiliations, of turning away at the exact moment another person needs presence. It is the cruelty that is available to anyone who has learned to prioritize the maintenance of their own psychological coherence over the demands of genuine encounter with another person's reality. You have done this, so have I. The only question is the frequency and the stakes. Here is where this gets more specific, because the general version is still too easy to handle. Think about what you have looked away from, not the obvious things, the causes you haven't donated to, the news you've stopped reading because it produces a feeling of helplessness that is uncomfortable to sit in. Those are real, but they are the publicly acknowledged version of the problem, the one that has already been incorporated into the self-narrative as evidence of your awareness. You know you benefit from systems you didn't build and wouldn't have chosen. That knowledge is already filed. Think about what you have looked away from closer in. The colleague whose treatment you recognized as unjust and said nothing about because the cost of speaking was clear and the benefit to them was uncertain. The family member whose difficulty you have reframed over years as a personality trait rather than a need, because treating it as a need would require something from you that you haven't wanted to give. The situation in which someone's reality was genuinely different from your account of it, and you were able to construct, from available evidence, a version of events in which your own role required no revision. These are not exceptional failures of character. They are ordinary. They are available to anyone with sufficient comfort to protect. Carl Jung would have said that the thing you couldn't look at got put somewhere, not discarded. The psyche doesn't discard, stored. And that stored material doesn't remain inert. It accumulates force. It seeks expression through the channels available to it. The person who has never examined their capacity for cruelty does not thereby fail to possess it. They fail to know where it is. Jung's concept of the shadow is not a metaphor for your dark side in the pop psychology sense of impulses to be managed and sublimated. It is a structural description of what happens to psychic content that the conscious personality refuses to accommodate. Everything excluded from the self-image, not just the violent impulses, but the selfishness, the cowardice, the hunger for approval that you've renamed as something more respectable, gets organized in the unconscious into what amounts to a counter-personality, a self that contains everything the presented self cannot afford to be. The shadow doesn't disappear when you become ethical, it becomes more sophisticated. There is a specific dynamic that Erich Fromm spent much of his intellectual life trying to name, and it is directly relevant here in a way that isn't often pointed to. Fromm, writing in the middle of the 20th century as someone who had watched European fascism develop from proximity, was trying to answer a question that the standard accounts of totalitarianism left incomplete. Why did so many ordinary people, not opportunists, not fanatics, but genuinely ordinary people, not just comply with what was being asked of them, but actively participate? Why did the embrace of authoritarian structures so often come not from coercion, but from something that looked from the inside like relief? His answer was the escape from freedom. The argument was this: genuine freedom, the freedom to be self-determining, to be the author of your own values, to stand without external justification for who you are and what you do, is experienced by most people not as desirable, but as unbearable. It produces anxiety at the root level of the self because it means that the responsibility for what you are cannot be located anywhere outside you. There is no system, no role, no ideology, no community whose authority relieves you of that weight. The escape from this freedom takes many forms. One of them is conformity, not the crude conformity of doing what everyone else does, but the subtler conformity of never allowing your values to place you in genuine opposition to the institutions you depend on. Another is submission to authority, not necessarily political authority, but any structure that provides, in exchange for the surrender of self-determination, the comfort of knowing what is required and what is permitted. The crucial insight is not that this escape is pathological. It is that it is the normal response to an abnormal burden. Most people, most of the time, are not navigating their lives from a position of genuine self-determination. They are navigating from a position of calculated belonging, doing what the systems they inhabit require in exchange for the security that belonging provides. When those systems require something terrible, the calculation doesn't disappear. It just becomes more expensive. This is the part of the argument that most people manage to understand abstractly and then quietly decline to apply to themselves. So it is worth slowing down here. You are embedded in systems right now that require things of you, not terrible things, not yet, and perhaps never. But the structure of the embeddedness is identical to the structure that Fromm was describing. Your professional position requires certain silences. Your social position requires certain agreements. Your sense of who you are, the narrative that holds the self together, requires that certain conclusions not be reached, or at least not be sustained long enough to require action. You are not resisting these requirements through strength of character. You are mostly not aware of them as requirements at all, because the compliance is so habitual that it has long since stopped feeling like a choice. It feels like the shape of the world. This is not a counsel of despair, but it is a warning against a specific kind of complacency, the kind that confuses the absence of having been tested with the presence of having passed. Hannah Arendt's deeper argument, the one that survives the specific context of Eichmann and becomes a general philosophical claim, is about the necessity of thinking. By thinking, she meant something precise. The willingness to stop, to interrupt the automatic processing of the situation through received categories, to ask whether what is being done, by you, in your name, with your participation, is actually what you would endorse if you looked at it directly. Most people, most of the time, are not doing this. They are doing what the situation makes obvious, what the role makes natural, what the narrative makes coherent. The people who stopped, in the historical cases she was drawing from, the people who refused when refusing was not yet forbidden, who registered a moral objection before the system had eliminated the space in which objections could be registered, were not, by the available evidence, people of exceptional virtue. They were people who had maintained the habit of thinking, who had not let the administrative density of the situation fill the space where reflection would otherwise have occurred. That habit is not a personality trait, it is a practice. And like all practices, it either remains active or it atrophies. There is something Nietzsche noticed about moral identity that doesn't get discussed in polite company, and it is directly relevant to the person this is addressed to. His concept of ressentiment, which he developed most fully in the genealogy of morals, is not simply the idea that resentment is a common human experience. It is a specific psychological mechanism by which people who cannot exercise genuine power over their own lives convert that incapacity into a moral framework that makes the incapacity virtuous. The oppressed discover that they are actually the righteous. The constrained discover that the unconstrained are corrupt. The inability to act becomes reframed as the choice not to act, as restraint, as principle, as evidence of superior character. The relevant point here is not about historical or political power. It is about the way moral identity functions as a compensation for something else. A person who has organized their sense of self around ethical distinction, who has built their self-narrative on the foundation of being someone who would not do the terrible things, has, in Nietzsche's terms, made a particular wager. They have decided that not doing is the same as being, that the absence of visible transgression constitutes a positive moral achievement. That character is demonstrated by what you have refrained from, rather than by what you have done. This is not entirely wrong. Restraint matters, limits matter. But when moral identity is primarily organized around what you are not and what you would never do, it becomes very difficult to examine what you are and what you have already done, because any such examination threatens the foundation on which the identity rests. The good person, in this configuration, is protected from self-knowledge by their goodness. The ethical self-image becomes the lock on the door. Viktor Frankl arrived at his central insight under conditions of deliberate cruelty so sustained and total that the ordinary resources of human psychology were systematically removed. What he retained, and what he observed others retaining or losing, was the capacity he described as the space between stimulus and response. The moment, however compressed, in which a human being can choose how to relate to what is happening to them. Not what is happening, not what others do, how to relate. His claim was not that this space always survives, he saw it destroyed. He saw people in whom the destruction of external freedom produced, progressively, the destruction of internal freedom, in whom the horror of the conditions eventually collapsed the gap between what was done to them and who they became. He did not blame them, but he documented the collapse. The specific relevance here is not to extreme conditions, it is to ordinary ones. The same mechanism that allowed some people to maintain themselves under the most extreme assault, the habit of inserting reflection between situation and response, is the mechanism that distinguishes a person who thinks from a person who merely functions within the thinking their situation provides. Most people are functioning within the thinking their situation provides. This is not a moral failure. It is the default. The situation has been constructed over years to make its own logic feel like your logic. The values you hold are largely the values available to you, given the social and cultural and economic position you inhabit. The atrocities you would never commit are largely the atrocities that your position has never made available. This is not a comfortable thing to recognize. It is also not a reason for despair. It is a reason for a different kind of attention. What would it actually mean to take this seriously? Not as an intellectual position, you have probably already accepted it at that level, because accepting it intellectually costs nothing, as something that changes the relationship to your own moral certainty. The concrete starting point for Arendt was thinking itself, not ethical reasoning in the academic sense, not working through utilitarian calculations or applying categorical imperatives. The prior step, actually stopping, actually interrupting the automatic processing, actually asking in relation to something specific in your actual life whether the comfortable account of it is the honest one. There will be something in your life, there is something in everyone's life, where the comfortable account and the honest account do not fully overlap. A relationship in which your account of who has been fair requires not examining certain evidence. A professional situation in which what you are participating in, looked at directly, does not match the principles you would cite if asked. A family arrangement in which the costs are not evenly distributed and your position near the less costly end has been naturalized as just how things are. These are not equivalent to collaboration with atrocity. But the structure is the same. The mechanism of not looking is the same. The role of narrative in making not looking feel like something other than a choice is the same. Arendt's most demanding implication, the one that gets the least attention, is that moral responsibility is not discharged by good intentions or accurate self-assessment. It is discharged, or not, by the actual activity of thinking in relation to your actual situation, You cannot be ethical in principle while declining to think about the specifics. The abstraction is not a substitute for the examination. Dostoevsky's Underground Man eventually produces a moment of excruciating clarity buried in the center of the text, when he recognizes that his entire project, the self-analysis, the elaborate self-justification, the performance of his own complexity, has been, at its root, an extended avoidance of the simplest possible demand, to act well toward one specific person in front of him, right now. The theory was in lieu of the action. The understanding was a substitute for the change. He cannot make the substitution stop, even knowing it for what it is. This is Dostoevsky's bleakest and most honest insight, self-knowledge, without some additional quality that he could not name precisely, but gestured at as love, is not sufficient to produce moral action. It can coexist with its exact opposite. The additional quality he was pointing at is not sentiment. Fromm, building on a different tradition but arriving at a structurally similar place, defined love in its genuine form as an active orientation toward the reality of another person, not a feeling, an act of will directed at knowing and caring about what is actually there, rather than what is convenient for your own psychological coherence that they should be. The person who has organized their moral identity around being ethical has not necessarily developed this orientation. They may have developed its appearance, a set of behaviors that look from the outside like active engagement with the reality of others. But that function, on examination, as a way of maintaining the self-image of someone who engages, the engagement is real enough that it doesn't feel like performance. But it stops at the boundary of what would genuinely cost something. Real moral encounter, the kind Fromm was describing, the kind Arendt was insisting was necessary, crosses that boundary. It requires letting another person's reality actually land, actually change something in how you see, actually produce an obligation that didn't exist before. It is uncomfortable in a way that the performance of ethics is not. Most people are performing most of the time, not cynically, with full sincerity. But the sincerity is contained within limits they have not examined. There is something Marcus Aurelius returned to with a persistence that is almost obsessive across 12 books of private notes he never intended to be read. He kept returning to the same instruction: do not flatter yourself about your virtue. Do not mistake the absence of having been placed in temptation for the presence of having resisted it. Do not confuse good fortune with good character. He was writing to himself. He was writing to the most powerful man in the Roman world, a man whose position provided every protection against the kind of conditions that reveal character. And he was warning himself repeatedly not to take that protection as evidence of what he was. He understood that power and comfort do not test the self. They only defer the test, and that a person who has never been tested does not know what they are. This is not a counsel of self-contempt. Marcus Aurelius was not a despairing thinker. He continued to act, continued to try to govern well, continued to return every morning to the same practice of self-examination. But he maintained, against the constant temptation to believe otherwise, a genuine uncertainty about whether he was who he thought he was. He kept the question open. Keeping the question open is not a comfortable posture. It is the opposite of the stable ethical identity that feels like an achievement. It means sitting with the possibility that the distance between you and the people you've distinguished yourself from is partially a function of the distance between your circumstances and theirs. That the goodness you've cultivated is partly a luxury of not having been placed in conditions that would have required something of it. And it means asking, without rushing to an answer that preserves the self-image intact, what it would mean to actually hold yourself to the standard you apply to others when looking at the past, not to destroy the self-narrative, not to manufacture guilt about circumstances you didn't choose, but to close, at least partially, the gap between the rigorous attention you direct outward toward what other people do and the considerably more lenient attention you typically direct inward toward what you do. The good news, such as it is not the kind that feels like good news. It is not that you are secretly virtuous and merely needed reminding. It is not that self-awareness is sufficient to prevent moral failure. It is something quieter and more demanding. The only thing that distinguishes people who act well from people who don't, under conditions that make it difficult, is the maintenance of a specific habit. The habit of thinking, of actually stopping, actually examining, actually refusing to let the situation fill in the answer before the question is fully formed. That habit is fragile. It requires conditions that support it, and conditions can be arranged to suppress it. But it is not a personality trait you either have or lack. It is a practice that either remains active or atrophies from disuse. The question is not whether you are a good person. That question has too much invested in its own answer to be genuinely examined. The question is whether you are thinking. Not about your life in general. Thinking is easy in general. About the specific thing in front of you right now that you have been processing through received categories without fully stopping. About the specific situation in your actual life that you have not examined because the examination would make the comfortable account harder to sustain. That is where ethics actually lives. Not in character, not in the self-image you've assembled over years of not doing the worst things, in the willingness to look, in this situation, at what is actually there. Most people, most of the time, decline, not from malice, from the same mechanism that produces everything on this scale, the ordinary preference for coherence over truth. The coherence is comfortable. The truth is what you're responsible for.